Clara Evans stood at the towering iron gates of the Knight mansion, gripping the strap of her worn-out bag as her heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, silently telling herself, "You can do this, Clara." The mansion was breathtaking, larger, grander, and far more intimidating than anything she had ever seen. It was a world completely different from her small countryside home, where life was simple, and money was always tight. This job was her chance to send money back to her struggling family, to help her younger siblings have a better future. She straightened her shoulders, pressing the intercom button. A crisp voice responded almost instantly, "Yes." Hi. I'm Clara Evans, the new nanny," she answered, hoping she didn't sound as nervous as she felt. A few seconds passed before the gates clicked open. Clara stepped inside, inhaling the fresh scent of roses lining the stone pathway. Each step she took echoed in the silence, the overwhelming size of the mansion, making her feel small. At the front door, she was greeted by a woman in her mid-50s with neatly styled hair and a warm, motherly expression. "You must be Clara," she said with a smile. "I'm Martha Wilson, the head housekeeper." "Welcome." Clara instantly felt a bit of relief at Martha's kindness. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am." "No need for formalities, dear," Martha chuckled. "Come in, I'll show you around." Clara followed her inside, trying not to gawk at the luxurious interior. The marble floors gleamed under the golden chandelier light, and elegant artwork adorned the high walls. Everything was pristine, a world of wealth beyond her imagination. "Your main responsibility is to care for young Ethan," Martha explained as they walked. "He's 5 years old, a quiet boy, but very sweet. Once you get to know him," Clara's heart softened. "I love kids. I'll do my best to make him feel comfortable with me." Martha smiled approvingly. "That's good to hear. Just be mindful around Mr. Knight. He's not the easiest man to deal with." Clara had already heard about Alexander Knight before she even took the job. A billionaire, a ruthless businessman, and a man known for his cold, emotionless demeanor. "I'll stay out of his way," Clara assured, though deep down she was curious about the man behind the rumors. Martha nodded before stopping in front of a door. "Here we are." Clara stepped inside, taking in the cozy bedroom prepared for her. Simple, yet elegant, far nicer than anything she'd ever had back home. She placed her bag down, excitement bubbling within her. She was about to begin a new chapter. A knock at the door made her turn. "You must be Miss Clara," a small voice said. She looked down and met the wide brown eyes of a little boy peeking inside. His messy dark curls framed his pale face, and there was a hint of sadness behind his shy expression. Her heart instantly softened. "You must be Ethan," she said warmly, crouching down to his level. "I've been so excited to meet you." Ethan hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. "Are you going to leave too?" Clara's breath hitched. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ethan fiddled with his fingers. "The last nanny left. And the one before that too." Clara's chest ached. She could see it in his small face. He was used to people leaving him. She reached out, offering him her pinky. "Well, I'm not like the others. I promise I'm here to stay." Ethan blinked at her, as if trying to decipher if she meant it. Then, slowly, he linked his tiny pinky with hers. "Okay," he whispered. Clara smiled. And at that moment she knew she wasn't just here for a job anymore. Clara adjusted the collar of Ethan's tiny jacket, making sure he was warm enough before they stepped outside for his first day with her. The boy had warmed up to her slightly. Though he was still cautious, as if afraid she'd disappear like the others. She wouldn't. She was determined to be different. As they made their way down the grand staircase toward the entrance, Clara finally saw him. Alexander Knight. The man she had only heard about in hushed whispers from Martha and the other staff. The cold, ruthless billionaire. The man whose mere presence seemed to command the entire room without saying a word. And now, he stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit. Phone in hand, sharp jaw clenched as he spoke in a low, clipped tone. Yes, push the meeting to next week. I don't care how urgent it is. Figure it out, he muttered. Email me the revised contract by tonight. His voice was deep, authoritative, sending an unexpected shiver down Clara's spine. Then, suddenly, he turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, Clara forgot how to breathe. His piercing blue eyes froze her in place, assessing her in a single glance. His presence was overwhelming, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm. This was a man who could destroy or save with a single decision. And right now, he was looking at her like she was an intruder in his world. Clara swallowed, forcing herself to break the silence. Good morning, Mr. Knight, she said as politely as possible. Ethan's all set for school. Alexander barely acknowledged her greeting. His gaze flicked toward his son instead. Come, he said simply. You're riding with me. Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly, but he nodded, gripping Clara's hand as they followed Alexander to the waiting black car. Inside, the silence was thick, tense. Clara glanced at Ethan, whose small hands were pressed together in his lap. His lips were pressed in a thin line, his usual sadness returning. She hated seeing that look on his face. Alexander, meanwhile, was focused on his phone, barely sparing them a glance. It was like they weren't even there. Clara exhaled slowly, then turned toward Ethan with a bright smile. Did you know, Ethan? Back home, we used to have to walk 2 miles just to get to school, rain or shine. Ethan's eyes widened. 2 miles? Clara nodded, sometimes even longer when the road was flooded. But you know what my friends and I did to make it fun? Ethan blinked. What? We'd play a game, she grinned. We'd try to spot 10 different animals on the way. Birds, dogs, cats, even cows. The first one to spot them all would win. Ethan actually smiled, his little curiosity shining through. Sometimes, Claire admitted. But my best friend was really good at it. She always found the hidden animals before I did. Ethan giggled. That sounds fun. It was a small moment, but Claire knew it mattered. However, when she glanced at Alexander, he was watching her. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his gaze. Then he spoke. You talk too much. Clara's cheeks burned. Excuse me? Alexander finally put his phone down, turning his sharp gaze on her. The car has been silent every morning. Until now, she frowned. And is that a bad thing? Alexander held her stare for a long moment before looking away, just unexpected. Clara didn't know what that meant. But when she turned back to Ethan, he was smiling at her. And that, for now, was enough. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Clara found herself in the grand library of the Knight Mansion, flipping through a book on child psychology. She hadn't planned to be a nanny forever, but she wanted to do this job right. Ethan deserved that much. The boy had so much love to give, but no one to give it to. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind her. "You're still awake." Clara jumped, nearly dropping the book. "Alexander." His voice was deep, smooth, but there was always a hint of cold detachment in the way he spoke, as if emotions were a luxury he had long abandoned. She turned, finding him standing in the doorway, his suit jacket missing, the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt rolled up to his elbows. He looked slightly more relaxed, though his intense gaze was the same. I was just reading," she stammered, shutting the book. Alexander's sharp eyes flicked to the cover. "Child psychology," he mused. "Are you doubting your ability to do your job?" Clara straightened. "No, Mr. Knight." "But I believe in doing my best."
Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable.
He stepped inside, moving to the liquor cabinet in the corner, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Clara stood frozen, unsure if she should leave or stay. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. "Ethan is a good boy." Clara's chest tightened. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, like he was trying to convince himself. "He is," she agreed softly, "but he's lonely." Alexander stilled, his fingers tightening around the glass. Clara knew she was treading dangerous ground, but she pressed on. "He misses you, Mr. Knight," she continued gently. "He talks about you all the time, even when you're not around." Alexander exhaled sharply. "I provide for him. He lacks nothing." Clara swallowed the frustration bubbling inside her. "He lacks you," she said before she could stop herself. Silence. Thick, heavy, unforgiving. Alexander's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, Clara felt like she had crossed a line she wasn't supposed to. But she refused to back down. She had seen Ethan's sadness firsthand. If Alexander didn't want to hear it, that was his problem. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a slow sip of his whiskey and set the glass down with a quiet clink. "You assume too much, Miss Evans," he said smoothly. "You've been here for 2 days, and you think you understand my son better than I do?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I don't assume, Mr. Knight. I listen." The air between them crackled with tension. For the first time, Clara felt like she had Alexander Knight's full attention. And, strangely, that realization sent a shiver down her spine. Alexander's jaw tightened, and without another word, he turned and left the room. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Something told her she had just started a war she wasn't prepared for. The morning after her tense conversation with Alexander, Clara braced herself for some kind of fallout. Would he fire her? Would he ignore her completely? She had no idea. But when she saw him at breakfast, sitting at the head of the long dining table, reading the financial news on his tablet, he didn't even look at her. Clara released a quiet breath. Maybe he had decided to pretend their conversation never happened. Ethan, sitting beside her, was happily munching on his pancakes, kicking his legs under the table. "Daddy," he suddenly said. Alexander barely lifted his eyes from his tablet. "I have a school play next week." Clara saw it, the hesitation in Ethan's little face, the hope that flickered there, waiting for an answer. Alexander turned a page on his tablet, barely glancing up. "I'll send someone to record it." Ethan's small shoulders slumped. Clara's grip tightened around her fork. Here was a little boy practically begging for his father's presence, and Alexander thought a recorded video was enough. Before she could stop herself, Clara spoke. "I think Ethan was hoping you'd be there in person, Mr. Knight." A beat of silence. Then, Alexander finally looked at her. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, sharp, calculating, assessing. Clara refused to back down. She turned to Ethan with a bright smile. "Tell your dad what role you got, sweetheart." Ethan hesitated, then perked up. "I'm playing the moon. My teacher said I have an important part because I helped the sun bring the morning." Clara's heart melted. Ethan was so excited, and yet his father sat there, unmoved. "Sounds important," Alexander said dryly. "It is," Clara pressed. "And important things deserve to be celebrated, don't you think?" Alexander's blue eyes darkened. For a moment, Clara thought he'd snap at her. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate care. Then he stood. "Enjoy your breakfast," he said flatly, before walking out of the dining room without another word. Ethan's face fell, the excitement draining from his features. Clara's heart clenched. "Maybe he's just busy," Ethan murmured, poking at his pancakes. Clara swallowed her frustration. This was why Ethan barely spoke. Because every time he tried, he was dismissed. "Hey," she said softly, ruffling his hair. "Even if your dad can't come, I'll be there." "And I'll be cheering the loudest." Ethan gave her a small smile. "You promise?" Clara held out her pinky. "Pinky promise." Ethan wrapped his little pinky around hers, sealing their deal. Clara had no idea if Alexander Knight would ever change, but she wasn't about to let his son feel like he wasn't worth fighting for. That Saturday, Clara found herself in the backyard of the Knight mansion, sitting on the grass with Ethan as they stacked small rocks, attempting to build a tiny castle. Ethan giggled every time their structure collapsed, his laughter warm and unrestrained, a stark contrast to the quiet, reserved boy she had first met. She loved seeing him like this. "Miss Clara, do you think Daddy would ever play with me like this?" Ethan suddenly asked, his small fingers brushing dust off a rock. Clara's hands stilled. She knew this question was coming eventually. She just hadn't been prepared for how much it would hurt. She gave Ethan a soft smile. "I think your dad loves you, Ethan. He just..." Ethan scrunched his nose. "He's always busy." Clara sighed, placing a hand on his back. "Maybe we should remind him how fun it is to take a break." Ethan blinked. "How?" Before Claire could answer, the sound of footsteps crunching on the stone pathway made her turn. Alexander, dressed in his usual dark suit, his sleeves rolled up slightly. His hair was neat, but there was a hint of exhaustion on his sharp features, like he hadn't slept well. Clara quickly stood, brushing dirt off her jeans. Ethan perked up. "Daddy!" Alexander's gaze swept over them before resting on his son. "I thought you had a piano lesson," he said, raising an eyebrow. Ethan shook his head. It got canceled. Alexander nodded, then turned to leave. Just like that. As if the conversation had already ended. Clara's patience snapped. "Wait," she said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "You're already here. Why not stay for a few minutes?" Alexander slowly turned back, his expression unreadable. "Stay?" Clara crossed her arms.
"Yes, just sit with us. Ethan would love that."
Ethan's hopeful eyes flickered between them. For a moment, Alexander looked conflicted. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply and removed his suit jacket. Clara's eyes widened. Was he actually agreeing? Alexander lowered himself onto the grass beside Ethan, stretching out his long legs. Ethan beamed. "Daddy, we're building a rock castle." Alexander glanced at the lopsided pile of stones. "It doesn't look very stable." Claire rolled her eyes. That's because someone keeps knocking it over. Ethan giggled. It's fun knocking it over. Alexander studied the tiny structure for a moment. Then, to Clara's absolute shock, he picked up a small rock and carefully placed it on top. Ethan gasped, eyes glowing with excitement. Clara watched in silent awe. It was just a small moment, a tiny, insignificant gesture. But to Ethan, it was everything. Alexander Knight, the ruthless billionaire, the man who barely made time for his own son, was playing with him. Ethan clapped. "Daddy, you made it taller." Alexander smirked. "I have excellent architectural skills." Clara couldn't help but laugh. Alexander shot her a sideways glance, but there was something softer in his expression. Something she had never seen before. And for the first time, Clara wondered if there was more to him than just his cold, distant mask. Maybe, just maybe, Alexander Knight wasn't as unreachable as she thought. The following week, the entire Knight mansion was buzzing with activity. The household staff whispered excitedly about an upcoming charity gala, an event filled with high-profile guests, extravagant gowns, and more importantly, Alexander Knight's rumored fiancé. Clara hadn't thought much of it at first, until she saw the news headlines. Rachel Carter spotted in New York ahead of her highly anticipated reunion with Alexander Knight. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure why she felt uneasy about it. It wasn't like Alexander was hers. He was her boss. That's it. But the way Ethan's face dimmed when he heard the news made her chest ache. "Does this mean now have a new mommy?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated. "I don't know, sweetheart." Ethan frowned. "But I don't want a new mommy. I just want Daddy to be happy." Clara forced a smile. "I think her dad wants to be happy too." Even if she didn't fully believe it. That night, after tucking Ethan into bed, Clara made her way to the kitchen for a cup of tea. She was halfway through stirring when she heard voices nearby. She recognized his immediately. Alexander. She turned the corner and froze. Rachel Carter stood in the foyer, looking every bit the elegant socialite. Her silk dress hugged her figure perfectly, her designer heels tapping lightly against the marble floor. She was stunning, sophisticated, the kind of woman who belonged in Alexander Knight's world. Clara wasn't even sure why she hid behind the pillar, listening. "You've been avoiding my calls," Rachel said, her tone smooth, slightly teasing. Alexander exhaled sharply. "I've been busy." Rachel stepped closer, resting a manicured hand on his chest. "Come on, Alex. It's been years. We always knew this would happen eventually." Clara's stomach twisted. She didn't know why, but hearing someone else call him Alex felt wrong. Alexander removed Rachel's hand with calculated ease. "You assume too much." Rachel pouted. "Don't I? You and I both know this arrangement is inevitable. It's good for our businesses. And for us." Clara felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the pillar. An arrangement. So that's what this was. Rachel wasn't here for love. This was a business move. A transaction. "Not interested," Alexander said flatly. Rachel huffed a quiet laugh. "Oh, Halloween. You always pretend you don't care, but we both know." "I don't pretend," he cut her off, his tone sharp. Final. "I don't care." Rachel's expression faltered, but only for a second. Then she smiled. "We'll see." With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the floor. Clara barely had time to move before Alexander's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. her breath caught. Eavesdropping, Miss Evans? Clara swallowed hard. I was just getting tea. Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. And did you enjoy the conversation? Clara met his gaze, trying to ignore the way her heart pounded. That depends. Are you actually getting married? Silence. Then, his lips curved into the faintest smirk. Why? He asked, stepping closer. Would that bother you? Clara's pulse skyrocketed. She didn't dare answer. She wasn't ready to admit, to him or herself, that the answer was yes. Clara couldn't stop thinking about that night. The way Alexander had looked at her, like he was waiting for an answer she wasn't ready to give, like he already knew what it would be. She had spent hours trying to convince herself it didn't matter. That his supposed engagement was none of her business. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. And things only got worse when she overheard the staff talking the next morning. The gala is happening in 2 days, one of the maids whispered excitedly. I heard Miss Carter is flying in from London to make a big announcement. Clara stiffened. An announcement? I bet it's the engagement, another voice chimed in. It's only a matter of time before Mr. Knight makes it official. Clara forced herself to keep walking, gripping Ethan's backpack tighter than necessary. Why did it hurt? She had no reason to feel this way. Alexander wasn't hers. She was just the nanny. She had to stop forgetting that. That evening, as she helped Ethan brush his teeth, he suddenly turned to her, his small face serious. Miss Clara, are you leaving? Clara's heart stopped. She crouched down beside him. Why would you ask that, sweetheart? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Because all the other nannies left. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She had promised him she wasn't like the others. But suddenly, she wasn't so sure anymore. Ethan's eyes searched hers. And because... Won't Miss Rachel want you to go away? Clara's stomach twisted. She couldn't lie to him, but she also couldn't tell him the truth, and she had no idea where she stood anymore. She forced a smile, brushing back his curls. Let's not worry about things that haven't happened yet. Okay? Ethan hesitated, then nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Neither did Clara. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Clara made her way downstairs for some fresh air. But she wasn't alone. Alexander was standing outside on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city skyline. She considered turning back, but before she could, he spoke. Couldn't sleep? Clara hesitated before stepping closer. Something like that. Alexander took a slow sip of his drink. Ethan's been talking about his play non-stop. Clara smiled faintly. He's excited. Alexander glanced at her. And you? She blinked. What about me? He tilted his head slightly. You've been avoiding me. Clara's pulse spiked. I haven't, she lied. Alexander let out a quiet, amused hum. You have. Clara's breath caught. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. You heard what the staff is saying, didn't you? She clenched her jaw. It's none of my business. His blue eyes darkened. And yet, it's bothering you. Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to pretend none of this mattered, but Alexander saw right through her. I told you before, he murmured, his voice lower, more intense. Rachel assumes too much. Clara swallowed hard. Then tell me the truth. Are you marrying her? Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then his answer came like a vow. No. Clara's breath hitched. But before she could say anything, he stepped even closer, his voice a whisper against the night. The real question, Miss Evans, is, what would you do if I did? And for the first time, Clara had no idea how to answer. Clara lay awake that night, Alexander's words echoing in her mind. The real question, Miss Evans, is, what would you do if I did? Why did he ask her that? What did he want her to say? She had stood there on that balcony, heart pounding, mouth dry, completely incapable of answering. Because the truth was terrifying. If Alexander married Rachel, Clara would leave. She had no choice. But the idea of walking away, of saying goodbye to Ethan, of never seeing Alexander again, hurt more than she could admit. And that terrified her more than anything else. The next morning, Clara tried to act normal. She smiled at Ethan, made him pancakes, and went about her day as if nothing had changed. But something had. She felt restless, unsettled. And things only got worse when Martha, the head housekeeper, approached her with a sympathetic smile. Clara, dear, I wanted to give you a heads up before you hear it from someone else. Clara's stomach tightened.
What is it?
Martha sighed. Rachel Carter arrived this morning. She'll be staying at the mansion for the weekend. The air left Clara's lungs. Oh. Martha studied her carefully. You okay, dear? Clara forced a smile. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? Martha didn't push, but her knowing eyes said everything. Clara turned away, gripping the kitchen counter to steady herself. Rachel was here, in the house. And for the first time, Clara felt like she didn't belong. That evening, Clara was helping Ethan pick out his pajamas when he suddenly asked, Is Ms. Rachel going to be my new mommy? Clara's hands froze. She turned to face him. Why'd you ask that, sweetheart? Ethan fiddled with the hem of his shirt, because she said so. Clara's stomach dropped. What do you mean? She asked, keeping her voice gentle. She told me that soon she'll be part of our family, Ethan said, his voice small, and that Daddy and I will love her. Clara clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath her skin. Rachel had no right to say that to him. She took a deep breath, kneeling in front of Ethan. Listen to me, sweetheart. No one gets to decide that except your dad. And you? Ethan bit his lip. But what if Daddy does marry her? Clara's chest ached. She didn't have an answer, so instead, she hugged him. Yay! Ethan nodded against her shoulder. But Clara didn't know if that was a promise she could keep. Later that night, Clara was heading downstairs when she overheard voices in the lounge. Rachel, and Alexander. She stopped in her tracks, hidden behind the wall. I don't see why you're still hesitating, Rachel said smoothly. We both know this is what's best. Alexander sighed. Best for whom? Rachel huffed. Don't be ridiculous. This is the smartest move. Our families, our businesses, it's logical. Clara gritted her teeth. Logical, not love. Alexander's voice dropped lower. You assume I want this? Rachel let out a quiet laugh. Oh, please. Who else would you even consider, Alexander? Clara's heart stopped. For a single terrifying moment, she thought she heard her own name lingering in the silence. But then Alexander simply said, I'll make my decision soon. Clara turned and hurried upstairs before she could hear more. Because suddenly, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The days following that tense evening felt like an endless storm of emotions for Clara. She kept her distance from Alexander and Rachel, avoiding any unnecessary interactions. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak to him. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak to him. It was that she wasn't sure what she would say more. Things had changed. The house seemed quieter, and not in a peaceful way. It felt as though every corner of the mansion was filled with an unspoken tension, a looming question that hung between them all. Would Alexander choose Rachel? Would Ethan finally get the family he longed for? And what about Clara? Where did she fit into this picture? She found herself spending more time with Ethan, distracting herself from the constant ache in her chest. Every laugh from him, every smile, made her feel like she had a purpose in this world. And yet, the weight of her unspoken feelings for Alexander was becoming harder to ignore. On the morning of the charity gala, Clara was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Ethan, when she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see the usual staff, but instead, it was Alexander, in a sharp black tuxedo, his hair styled neatly. He looked more distant than ever, his eyes cold and unreadable as he entered the kitchen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire's hands froze on the countertop, her heart racing. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "I'll be leaving for the gala soon." His voice was flat, as though he was discussing the weather. Clara nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know. Ethan's already excited for the event." There was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't place. "I need you to stay with him tonight," Alexander said after a pause. "I'll be back late." Clara blinked, surprised. She had expected him to be completely wrapped up in the gala, in Rachel. But he was asking her to stay with Ethan. "Of course," she said softly, though her mind raced. Why was he asking her? Was this a request or just a formality? Alexander turned to leave, but then stopped. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "Clara," he began, his voice softer this time. "I know I haven't been." Clara looked at him, confused. Was he apologizing? "I've been caught up in work and in everything else, but I see what you're doing for Ethan. And I'm grateful. I don't want you to think I don't appreciate it." Clara swallowed, trying to hold back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't know what to say. "Mr. Knight, I'm just doing my job." She forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. "Ethan needs someone. And I'm happy to be here for him." Alexander nodded, but there was something different in his gaze now. Something soft and vulnerable that made Clara's breath catch. "Good night," he said before leaving, but this time his voice held an odd tenderness. Clara stood there for a moment, her thoughts a whirlwind. She didn't know if he was just being polite, or if there was something more in his words, something hidden beneath the surface. But as she went to check on Ethan, she realized one thing. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him any longer. The truth was, no matter how hard she tried, she was falling for him. And that terrified her. Because the more she tried to deny it, the harder it became to imagine walking away, especially when her heart was so deeply intertwined with Ethan's, and the man who had captured her soul with every silent glance and every unspoken word. The night of the charity gala arrived, and Clara found herself standing in front of the full-length mirror in the guest bedroom, adjusting her simple yet elegant dress. The gown was nothing extravagant, but it was enough to make her feel a little more alive amidst the storm of emotions she had been trying to manage in the past few days. She had decided to attend, not for the glitz or glamour, but for Ethan. He had been so excited about the gala, even if he didn't fully understand the significance of it. He was happy to see his father in the spotlight, and Clara didn't want to take that joy from him, even if her own heart was in turmoil. As she finished getting ready, she heard the sound of footsteps outside the door, followed by a quiet knock. "Clara, are you ready?" It was Alexander. His voice was smoother than usual, but there was something about it that made her pause. It wasn't just the command of his tone. It was almost pleading. "Just a second," Clara called back, quickly smoothing the fabric of her dress. She took one final look at her reflection, hoping she looked the part of the professional nanny she was meant to be, and not the woman desperately in love with her boss. She opened the door, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his usually sharp features softened just enough to make him look human. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Wow!" Clara blinked. "What?" "You look amazing." His voice was softer than she expected, the word amazing hanging in the air between them. She couldn't help but blush. "Thank you." Alexander's expression flickered, but it was gone before she could figure it out. "Ethan's waiting downstairs. I'm sure he's dying to see you." Clara nodded, her stomach tight. "I'll be down in just a moment." As she started to move past him, Alexander reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. Just a fleeting touch. She looked up at him in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. "Clara," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "I meant what I said. I appreciate what you've done for Ethan. You've done more than I could have ever expected." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to say that. Not after the way he had acted. It almost felt like he was opening a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Knight." She forced the words out, trying to steady herself. He smiled, but it was faint, barely there. "I've never been good at expressing gratitude." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. But her words felt hollow, like they didn't carry the weight she wanted them to. The truth was, the more time she spent in his presence, the harder it was to keep her feelings hidden. She knew she couldn't afford to get involved with him. Not when he was already planning a future with someone else. Not when he would always be a man of business, duty, and distance. But something in his eyes said that maybe he felt the same. "Let's go," she said quickly, not trusting herself to say more. Together, they walked down the stairs, their footsteps in sync, as they entered the bustling living room. Ethan's face lit up when he saw them, his little arms reaching out for Clara. "Mommy," he squealed. Clara stopped in her tracks, her heart aching at the word, knowing how much it meant to him. She knelt down and pulled him into a tight hug. "Hey, buddy, ready to have some fun?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "Daddy's gonna win. I know it." Alexander raised an eyebrow, a small chuckle escaping him. "Is that so?" Ethan's grin widened. "Yup, you're the best, Daddy." As Alexander's gaze softened on his son, Clara realized that no matter what happened that night, this was the moment that would define everything. She was in the middle of a story she didn't fully understand yet, but she couldn't deny that she felt like she was being pulled deeper into Alexander's world. One that wasn't just about business, money, or appearances. It was about family. And maybe, just maybe, she could belong here. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions, unable to stop the storm that had started the moment Alexander Knight had walked into her life. The distance between them remained, but it had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding that Clara couldn't ignore. Every glance, every quiet moment with him seemed to pull her deeper into something she wasn't sure she was ready for. It wasn't just Ethan anymore. It wasn't just about being the nanny. Something was changing between them. Alexander had started showing up for Ethan more, at first with quiet gestures, attending his school play, even playing with him in the garden. But there was a tension now, something that had been building in the quiet moments when neither of them spoke. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Clara found herself standing in the hallway, staring at the door to Alexander's office. She had never crossed that line before, always respecting the boundaries of their employer-employee relationship. But tonight was different. There was something between them now, something unspoken, yet undeniable. And she couldn't shake the feeling that they were both on the brink of something that could change everything. Before she could second guess herself, the door creaked open. Clara, Alexander's voice came low, almost like an invitation. She didn't know if it was the drink he'd had or the exhaustion in his eyes, but something about him seemed different. He didn't wait for her to speak, his gaze steady and piercing. "Come in. We need to talk." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and without thinking, she walked into the room. The soft glow of the desk lamp bathed Alexander in a warm light, and for the first time in a while, Clara saw the weariness in his face. Not just from work, but from something else, something he wasn't saying. As she entered, he moved aside, gesturing for her to take a seat. Clara hesitated, but sat down, her heart pounding. "What's this about, Mr. Knight?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the bar and poured himself another drink, his back to her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and Clara felt like she was drowning in it. When he turned back, his eyes met hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "You were right." His voice was barely above a whisper. Clara blinked. "Right about what?" He took a slow breath, then walked over to the window, his profile shadowed in the dim light. "I've been a terrible father, and worse, a terrible man." His voice cracked, just slightly, and Clara felt her chest tighten. Alexander wasn't the type to show vulnerability. This wasn't the man who had brushed off her concerns about his son. This was someone more real, more human. "Ethan deserves better," he continued, his gaze falling to the ground. "I've been so consumed with my work, with everything else, that I've neglected the one thing that really matters." Clara's heart ached for him, for the pain she saw in his eyes. And yet, it made her question everything. "Mr. Knight, you're not alone in this," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Ethan loves you. He needs you to show up more. That's all." Alexander's eyes flickered with something that looked like regret. "I don't know how to do that, Clara." His voice was raw. "I don't know how to fix everything I've broken." Clara didn't know what possessed her to do it, but she stood and walked to him. Without thinking, she placed a hand on his arm, gently. The touch was instinctive, and it felt like it could either shatter everything or change it for good. "You don't have to fix it all at once," she said softly. "Just try. That's all anyone can ask for." He turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers, and in that moment, Clara felt like she had crossed a line. The space between them had closed, and there was no going back. "Clara," he whispered, his voice low and laden with something she couldn't place. "I've been trying to figure out if I was just imagining this. What I feel when I'm with you." Her breath caught. This wasn't happening. But it was. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. She froze, heart racing, as his lips hovered just inches from hers. "I don't know how to do this," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. but I can't stay away anymore." And in that moment, Clara knew everything had changed. The days after their conversation felt like a slow unraveling, a series of small steps towards something neither Clara nor Alexander had fully understood until now. For the first time, the lines between employer and employee were no longer clear. There was an undeniable connection between them that neither of them could ignore. But it wasn't just about their chemistry. It was about the way Alexander had opened up, and the way she had let him in. Their worlds were colliding, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Clara spent the next few days trying to find clarity, to understand what she truly wanted. She loved working with Ethan. She loved working with Ethan. She loved being a part of his life, but everything was changing. Alexander's distance, his struggle with his emotions, it all felt so complex. And yet, with each passing day, Clara realized that she was growing more attached to him than she had ever intended. She was falling in love with a man who, despite his faults, was trying. For the first time in years, he was trying. For his son, for her. But her heart was a battlefield. The idea of being with him, of giving in to what was building between them, terrified her. There was too much to lose, too much at stake. She wasn't sure if she could handle the fallout if things went wrong. What if she couldn't live up to the expectations he had for her? What if she failed? It was late one evening when Alexander called for her. She had just finished putting Ethan to bed, her heart heavy with indecision. As she walked into the study, she noticed the way Alexander was sitting, his posture rigid, like he was waiting for something he wasn't sure how to say. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. She nodded, her throat dry. She was about to speak, but the words felt too heavy, so she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he began, "about what I said, about what I feel." His eyes met hers, soft but intense. His gaze held her, steady and unwavering. "You've changed my perspective on things. On being a father, on being a man." Clara's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the same Alexander she had known at the beginning. Cold, distant, unaffected. This man was vulnerable, raw. "I've been trying to figure out how to make it right," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "I've been afraid, Clara, afraid of losing everything I've worked for, but more than that, I've been afraid of how much I've already lost, especially when it comes to you." Her breath caught in her chest. He stopped her with a raised hand, his face softening. "Please, just hear me out. I don't want to regret this. I don't want to regret this. I don't want to regret not taking the chance when I had it." Clara stood frozen, her mind racing. She had never imagined she would be standing here, listening to this man. This complex, distant man. This complex, distant man speak of regret and fear. The words didn't seem to belong in the same sentence, but here they were. And for a brief fleeting moment, she wondered if she could let her own fear slip away. "I need you, Clara," he said, stepping closer, his voice low but sincere. "I need you here. Not just for Ethan, but for me. I don't want to go another day without telling you that." The room seemed to grow smaller as Clara's heart began to race. Every part of her wanted to say something. Anything. But she couldn't find the words. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, and I don't expect it to be easy," he added. His eyes locked on hers. "But I'm asking you to give us a chance, to give me a chance. Give me a chance. We can figure it out together." Claire's world tilted. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. All she could do was look at him, her eyes searching for something she hadn't been able to define. He was asking her to take a leap of faith, to trust him in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized she didn't have to be ready. She only had to be honest with herself. And right there, in that moment, she knew she was ready to try. With a soft breath, she stepped toward him, closing the distance between them. Without a word, she placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. Alexander's hand found hers, and in that simple touch, everything they had been dancing around for weeks finally fell into place. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's figure it out." And in that moment, everything felt like it was finally, truly, falling into place. The story of Clara and Alexander is one of transformation, growth, and the realization that love isn't just about finding someone perfect, but about building something together, even with imperfections. Clara, initially hired to be a nanny, never expected to find herself at the heart of a powerful and complex family dynamic. She taught Alexander that it's not enough to provide for someone materially. True connection comes from presence, understanding, and vulnerability. On the other hand, Alexander learned to open up, to move beyond his rigid boundaries, and embrace the possibility of a future he never thought he deserved. The most significant lesson here is that love requires patience and understanding. It's not always about grand gestures or timing. Sometimes it's about showing up for each other in the little moments. It's about being there for those who need us, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Clara's courage to take risks and Alexander's willingness to change teach us that love isn't just something that happens. It's something we create, day by day, with intention and care. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories that inspire and teach valuable lessons. Let's keep the conversation going.